In 1975, you earned your PhD from Columbia University, Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. What did you study there and research for your dissertation?
Well, I had an unusual academic career. After I graduated college, I went to work for a magazine called The New Leader, which was a small, it's no longer existent, but it was a small magazine founded by dissidents from the Russian Revolution, Mensheviks. And I worked on and off there for a few years as an editorial assistant, and had children. Was very engaged in raising them, but also in trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, which I hadn't figured out. But I came to the idea after the loss of Stephen. That was in 1966. Now I graduated college in 1960. In 1966, when Stephen died, there were two things I really wanted. One was to have another child, and Michael was born a year later. And the other was I needed to figure out what to do with my mind, which I couldn't just stay home and be a housewife. I couldn't do that. So I had been writing pieces and sending them off and getting rejections, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know enough about anything to be a writer. But then actually it was through Linda Gottlieb, recommended me to a friend of hers at the Carnegie Corporation, and the Carnegie Corporation was seeking someone to do, I guess, research for them, but not real research as you would understand it. But they got a request, for example, from the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation said, we're underwriting a series of experiments in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and in 2 other districts in New York City, and they're experiments in community control, and would you join us and help us fund it? So they said, well, what we'd like you to do is to go out and visit these communities, interview people, talk to them, sort of like a journalist, really, not a researcher, and then write up what you think. Why they trusted me to do this, I have no idea, because I had no experience doing anything. And I did that. I went to these districts that later became the center of the 1968 teachers' strike in New York City that closed the schools down for 2 months. So I interviewed people, went to classrooms, met some of the community leaders, and had a variety of other kind of experiences that made it possible for me to write something up for them. I did other similar kinds of journalistic quick takes on things that they wanted to know about. Why they didn't have anyone on staff to do it, I don't know, but they didn't. And I started thinking, particularly because of my interviews in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and at IS 201 in Harlem, I started thinking, gee, this is so interesting what's happening in New York City. There are all these demands for decentralization, for community control. It seems so odd that the New York City school system would all be controlled by one organization, and I wonder why. So I went to the library, and I began to look for a history of the New York City schools to explain it. And the latest one that I could find, and this was in the late 1960s, the latest I could find was written in 1905. And I thought, wow, that seems kind of odd that nobody has explained anything between 1905 and 1968. And I guess my inquiry was taking place right before the teacher strike. Then the teacher strike happened, and it was, as you can imagine, 2 months without school in New York City. This was this was like the event of the moment, of the day. And so I learned a little bit by reading the history from 1905, and I thought, geez, this is a really good article. I could write this article about how the schools used to be decentralized, then why did they become centralized? And so I sent it to someone I had met socially who worked as an editor of the New York Times Magazine. And I said, would you be interested in an article on this? And he said, he wrote me a very kind of brush-off response, saying something like, no, we're not interested. And he said, if you ever write an article called I Danced with My Dentist, that would interest me. I mean, talk about a put-down, And today we would say that was rank sexism.
Sure.
So I thought, wow, this is such a good subject. I can't let this go. So I went back to the library and I read some more. And then I talked to my friends who had been sending me out to do these journalistic jobs, $5 an hour. And I said, I said, you know, this really interests me, and I think I want to write a history of the New York City schools. So they're like, uh-huh. Okay, that sounds interesting. They said, why don't you go see Lawrence Crimmen, who's at Teachers College. He's one of our grantees. They had given him a very large grant at that time of $100,000 to write the definitive history of American education, not American public education. And Crimmen's view of education was very broad. There were schools, but there was also newspapers, and there were families, and there were, you know, every institution, the plantation and colonial, everything had some part to do with educating the people. So he had this very broad latitudinarian view of education. I was interested in the public schools. And at their suggestion, I went to see him, and he was just great. I mean, I saw him, you know, I still have the date on my calendar. It was like January 10th, 1968. And we spent 2 hours talking. And I said, this is what I want to do. And he said, well, have you read this? No. Have you read that? And then he started making a reading list for me. And he said, I really don't think you should attempt to write a history of the schools. Do you have a master's degree? I said, no. He said, have you ever written a book? No. Have you written articles? I said, well, I've published a few in the New Leader because I was working there and doing book reviews there. And he said, no. He says, I think a book's going to be too overwhelming. Forget about that. Write some essays and see how that goes. And when you've got an essay or two, get back to me. Well, we had a great talk. I was so inspired. And I went and I read all the books that he assigned to me. And then they led to more books. And then I went to the New York, spent lots of time in the New York Historical Society, digging through the archives. And that led me to other places and other archives and other things and more. And it was like one thing leads to the next thing leads to, and I said, I love this stuff. Of course, I had to work it in while having young children, and in this case, and you know, because Stephen was born, not Stephen, when Michael was born, then I had 2 children to take care of, 5 years apart, and so I had to kind of work around taking care of them and doing what needed doing. So how did I get my PhD, and what did I do? First, I wrote the book. I came to see Crimmen, and I said, I don't have an essay for you. I have the first quarter of my book. And he was like, oh. Okay, he said, I'll read it. And it was 125 pages. And then he got back to me a couple of weeks later, and he said, keep going.
Oh, nice.
He said, this is okay. You know, he didn't say it's the greatest thing I ever read. He didn't say, forget about it, you're no good. He said, keep going. So I saw him probably 4 times, and each time I saw him, I brought him the next quarter, which would be in, you know, like 3 chapters or 2 or 3 chapters. And he said, you know, it's looking good. And then I found a publisher, and then Crimmen went off to a summer, a thing that he did every summer. He went to Stanford, to the Center on Social and Behavioral Sciences, and he came back from that summer, and he said, I was in the swimming pool, and I saw Bruno Bettelheim. You know who he is? And I said, oh, yeah, you know, I've read some of his stuff. He's great. And he said, he asked me what you do, because he saw I had written an article then in Commentary magazine about the New York City school strike. And Crimmen had given me some kind of non-paid fellowship at TC so I could use the library. So I was a fellow of the Institute of Philosophy and Politics of Education at Teachers College, and I got to write their newsletter, and I would be able to sit and listen to the meetings. So he asked me what you were doing, and he asked me if you were working on a degree, and I told him you were not. And he said, why not? And he said, because, Crimmen said, I advised her she doesn't need a degree, that we're too degree conscious in this society, and that you should just keep writing. So Bettelheim said, tell the young lady that I disagree with you. Tell the young lady she needs to get a doctorate or she will hit the glass ceiling very quickly. So he said, I'm bringing you news that Bruno Bettelheim doesn't agree with me. I said, I agree with Bruno Bettelheim. I don't agree with you. I'm going to get a doctorate. So I started taking courses, took a French exam, you know, studied up for something. I had taken French in college many, many years earlier. By then I was, I guess, 32 or so. And I remember running into a historian at Columbia. We were at a child's birthday party, like our kids were in nursery school together. And so I said, I'm thinking I want to get a PhD, and I wonder if I should apply to Columbia. He said, well, how old are you? I said, I'm 32. He said, you have 3 strikes against you. He said, first of all, you're too old. And second, he said, you're a woman, and the Columbia History Department, it doesn't really want women. And third, you're studying a field that's not of interest to the Columbia History Department. Go to Teachers College. So I went back and told this to Kremen, who had a joint an appointment both in Columbia and Teachers College, and he said, well, you will work towards a PhD in the Columbia Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and you won't have your degree from the Columbia History Department. It will be from Columbia University, and it will be a PhD, not an EDD. But you'll work for it. I said, okay. So eventually, I did the coursework, did the seminars, but when it came time to do the dissertation, I had just finished
your book,
The Great School Wars, and it was published, and it had just come out. And I said to Kremen, can I use this as a dissertation? He said, no.
Oh, no.
And then I was having dinner, all these kind of interesting things come back as we're talking. I was having dinner one night with Patricia Graham. Pat Graham was another student of Larry Kremen's, who went on to become the president of the Spencer Foundation, the dean of the graduate school at Harvard. And I said to Pat, what do you think? Larry says I can't use this as my dissertation. He said, that's ridiculous. Dan Bell got his published work accepted at Columbia. And she said, actually, there have been probably a half a dozen books accepted at Columbia because they were respectable scholarly works. So she said, here's the process you go through. So I went to Kremen and I said, I'm going to do this. And he said, I told you not to. I said, I don't agree with you. So I went through whatever the hoops and hurdles were. And he said, okay, so here's what we do. We have never done this at Teachers College. We convene a committee, and the committee was Donna Shalala, Kenneth Jackson from Columbia, Douglas Sloan from Teachers College in History, Kremen, and there may have been one other person, but definitely those four. And he said, you will present your book, they will read your book, you'll present it as your dissertation, and you will not have an opportunity to revise because it's published. So you will get a vote of up or down. If it's down, you have to start from scratch. I said, I'm willing to take my gamble, because I'd been going through the library reading the dissertations, many of the dissertations, and I thought, this is as good as all of these things. I mean, it's certainly in a league. So I got voted up. I got the doctorate, but I did, all the necessary coursework, took the language exam, took the statistics course, although I'm not good at statistics, so, that was then and this is now. And that's how I got my doctorate, and it was the Great School Wars.
The Great School Wars was your dissertation. Served as that. At that time, did you know what role you would eventually play in the federal policy or educational policy landscape?
Absolutely not. I really didn't know much about federal policy, and I wasn't. I don't think I had the political science background, but I didn't know where I was going with it. I just thought I love doing historical research. This is so much fun. But I was also, like trying to be a good mother, so I had a lot of pulls. And very often, while I was writing The Great School Wars, I would write from the time the kids went to bed until midnight or 1 in the morning. And it was tough on my husband, but I tried to make sure that it wasn't tough on my kids.
Sure. Finding balance. From 1991 to 1993, you served as the Assistant Secretary of Education under the administration of President George Bush Sr. How did that come about?
It came about because I was recommended to the position by my friend Checker Finn. Checker had served in the same role in the Reagan administration, and Checker and I had been friends, I guess, since the early 1980s, and we had created something called the Educational Excellence Network, which was just a news bulletin about stuff that was happening around the country having to do with tests, standards, the curriculum, and we shared a common view about how education needed to be far, far better than it was. So we were very much in sync, and he was at Vanderbilt, and while he was at Vanderbilt, he worked a lot with Lamar Alexander, who was the governor, and they created things like career ladders, and I don't know if they did testing, but he was very close to Lamar. And then when George Bush Sr. was president, he changed secretaries of education in the middle of his term and switched from Lauro Cavazos to Lamar Alexander. And Checker recommended me to have the position that he had held earlier in the Reagan administration as Assistant Secretary for Research.
And Francie Alexander, your friend, noted that you almost turned down the position. She said that as brilliant as you are, you felt fashion challenged.
Yes. It's always been a great joke that I'm like the worst dresser in the world. And I
think
remember,
you look lovely today.
Thank you. I try harder now. But I've always liked working at home. I've never been able to write in an office. And so whether it was working at home in the back room when I was living in Manhattan, or working at home now that I'm living in Brooklyn, I like working at home. I like being able to get up, to stay up till 2 in the morning or wake up at 5 in the morning, whenever it is. I can go to it used to be my typewriter, now it's my computer. And so I never work in pajamas, but I do like to wear blue jeans and sweats.
And sweatshirts.
So I remember when I was invited to work in D.C., I said, but I would have to get dressed every day. I wear blue jeans. And they said, oh, I remember Lamar saying, you can do it. Everybody else manages to put on heels and a skirt. You can too. And I thought, well, I'll think about this.
Yeah.
And I did think hard about it. First of all, because I was not a Republican. Secondly, because I didn't know if I was up to the job. Checker assured me that I was. And that, when you move in, there are lots of people around you who know what you're supposed to do and who'll help you. And then there was this issue of, my God, I have to go out and buy some clothing.
Sure. She also says that you wore a sheriff's badge. Very lovely.
Well, going back to your comment about Michael saying I had a certain sense of the absurd, I periodically would do things like wear cowboy boots or wear a sheriff's badge or just do things to shake people up. And at one point, when I got there, I realized that the office came with 2 speechwriters. And I said, I don't know what you guys are going to do. People don't write my speeches for me.
Sure.
But I tried to make the place more fun for people. But I would often close the door and just write because there was a lot of writing to be done. I wanted to review everything that came out of our office in terms of policy statements, in terms of explaining what we were doing. I got very involved, and I told. When I accepted the job, I met with Lamar Alexander and his deputy, David Kearns, who was a wonderful, wonderful man who had been the CEO of Xerox. And I said to them that I was really interested in things like standards and curriculum. And so they said, well, we are too. Now, there was no authorization to do anything in the U.S. Department of Education. In fact, there's a specific ban saying the U.S. Department can do nothing about curriculum. But we were interested, or I was interested in promoting the idea of voluntary national standards. And so during the time I was there, I worked very closely with Francie Alexander. And Francie I'm somewhat disorganized. Francie is like the most organized person I've ever known in my life. You could walk into her office and you'd never see a piece of paper on her desk. Mm-hmm. You'd walk into mine and you'd try to find me behind all the pieces of paper stacked up on my desk. But we worked very hard on the idea that if you could bring together all the relevant professional groups in any field, they might be able to reach consensus on what kinds of aspirational standards to create. The idea being, for instance, and we were very involved, for example, in promoting standards in the arts. And so all the arts educators got together and came out with a document about what children should know and be able to do in different grades. And in part it was, there were resource standards saying you can't do this. You can't teach music unless you have musical instruments, unless you have people who can teach music and art and the other things. So this, in a way, the template had been set by the people with the math standards. They had started this, and that at the time was quite controversial, but nonetheless the math was out of there. The U.S. Department of Education had helped promote the National Academy of Sciences in developing science standards. And then we went off to work with other fields and to say history standards, art standards, civic standards, economic standards. Arnold Schwarzenegger went to see President Bush and said, and why not physical education standards? And so President Bush called Lamar Alexander, and voila, we have physical education standards in the works too. So we ended up not directly, but indirectly, supporting professional groups that developed standards of what children should know and be able to do at different grade levels. And we never had a mechanism to make it happen. Our thought was that if they were good, states would follow and use them. And then it subsequently turned out, after we left office, there was a great flap over the history standards, and the whole thing blew up.
Sure.
So it didn't work out as planned, but it probably had something to do with advancing the whole idea of standards, but as I explained in my last book, not in the way that I envisioned. No Child Left Behind turned out to be quite different from what we were talking about. There's nothing about the arts and civics and all of the sciences, all the different things that we saw as bringing in people and working with the people who actually know what they're doing.
Hijack the standards. So we have you to thank for the national and state standards. What do you think about the Common Core?
Well, I've been agnostic. I have neither written for them nor against them because I've had this experience with standards. Before I got into the federal government, one of the things I did that was very rewarding was that I worked in California, which is where I met Francie Alexander. I worked in California for, maybe it was a period of 2 years, developing the state history social science standards. And that was a really fascinating experience, firstly for the people that I met, and also seeing the process where teachers, administrators, subject matter experts, professors from different universities sat together and talked about what you would be doing in different grades. I got particularly interested in the early grades because I felt that they were an empty area that could be filled with wonderful stuff that kids would love reading and doing. But I saw how the process works, how important it is to bring in different views and get people to meet and talk together. But also, after you get a document, how important it is to send it out to teachers to try out. And it's through the tryouts you discover whether the written document works or not. You find out the teacher feedback tells you this doesn't belong in this grade, it belongs somewhere else, or this doesn't belong anywhere, it's not workable. And so you learn through the implementation. And if you haven't done the implementation, having the words on paper is not enough. So where we are now with the Common Core is we have words on paper that have never been tried anywhere. And so my feeling about it is they may turn out to be wonderful, they may turn out to have huge problems that have not been adequately anticipated, but how can we know until they've been tried? And last year I met with some people in the administration in Washington, and when they asked the same question that you asked, I said, why don't you pilot them? Why don't you pilot them and give a few states some money and try them out, and you're going to learn things you don't know now. They'll tell you what works and what doesn't work, but you don't know that now, and you're doing it in, 45 states? So we're going to have a pilot where everybody's doing it at the same time. And
it's a mandate.
So it could be wonderful, but on the other hand, if it's rigorous, really rigorous, it could increase the achievement gap. It could make it that much harder for the kids who are behind and who enter school with learning difficulties. They'll fall farther behind. So that's a possibility, and I don't think that's been adequately thought out. And I would just love to see a pilot test. I think the FDA would not send a drug out to everybody with the same illness without having done clinical trials. So I think the clinical trials, we will regret that we didn't have them, because it'll be implemented in a million different ways, and there'll be no way to fix whatever the errors are. And there are always errors.
Yeah, fidelity of implementation and everything. You also were responsible for the development of the Office of Educational Research and Improvement, OERI, at the U.S. Department of Education. Of all the initiatives that you were in charge of, what are you most proud?
Oh gosh, we really didn't have very many initiatives. Most of what I was there not a long time. It was only about 18 months, and I was pleased with the work on promoting standards. Although now I think it's definitely a mixed legacy. I'm not even sure it's a legacy. And there was no time for initiatives. We had no money. We had probably $10 million in discretionary funds. I look at that in the context of $5 billion for Race to the Top. And I think $10 million, we had the department's discretionary money, and it was nothing. And we used it all to promote these voluntary efforts to develop standards. So what we had another initiative called How to Help Your Child Do XYZ, which were parent guidebooks that were written very directly to parents about how to help their children in school, how to help your child learn to read, how to help your child learn science. Those were good. But, in 18 months with no money and with a Congress that was certainly unfriendly to anything coming from that administration, I don't think there were any other initiatives that I can point to and say, look what we accomplished there.
Sure.
One of the congressional aides, a very high-level guy, said to me when I first arrived and I came to say hello, he said, you're not going to accomplish anything here. So maybe he was right. But you know what I did accomplish? Nothing for the public. I learned a lot. Mm-hmm. I learned, first of all, I met lots of people who are still not in the same jobs. Very little changes in Washington.
And what you learned eventually hit the public in everything you've done since, too.
Yeah, well, it's like everything that I mean, maybe it was part of my learning process. It certainly didn't do anything for the country. But I met lots of people. I got to understand the organizational landscape of D.C. I got to understand the think tank world. And I got to understand how the legislative process works. Before all I knew, it was what I'd read in the textbooks. And then I got to understand how Washington works. And, I guess that's something you can spend your life learning. But I learned so much in the 2 years that I was in D.C. And when I left, right before I left the government, the head of Brookings came to see me, Bruce McLaury, and he offered me a chair at Brookings. And I said, but I don't want a chair. I want to go back to New York. And he said, would you like to have a senior position and write a book here? I said, sure, I'd love to, because I needed time to decompress. Mm-hmm. So I stayed on in Washington for another 15 or so months and wrote a book at Brookings called National Standards in American Education, a citizen's guide. And it's hard to say what side I'm on there, because I'm just trying to lay out lots of information about the pros and cons. And I'm sort of for them, but I'm also concerned about some of the side effects. Anyway, that was my next step after D.C. And then while I was at Brookings, I called up the president of Teachers College, no longer Kremen, who had died. I probably wouldn't have done anything if Kremen had remained alive, but he died in 1990. And I called up his successor, with whom I co-taught courses at TC. And I said, well, my books and files are still at TC. I'm ready to come back. And he said, after there was a long pause, and then he kind of gasped or giggled or something and said, actually, your colleagues don't want you back.
Yeah.
So I didn't go back to TC.
You went to NYU, is that right? And you're still there today?
Well, saying I'm at NYU is saying I'm affiliated with NYU. I have an office at NYU, but I do all my work here.
Here, in your sleds.
I don't teach. I've taught some courses there. I've never been tenured. I was not tenured at TC, and I'm not tenured at NYU. And so I've occasionally taught courses at NYU, but at this point in my life, I'm 73, I'm not going to be teaching anymore.
Did you ever have a desire to be a tenured professor?
Briefly, many, many years ago, and at that time, nothing was available, and I realized, well, what I really want to do is to write, and I need the doctorate in order to write, and I'll teach courses if whenever anybody wants me to. So I taught courses like in history of urban education, or issues, contemporary issues in education. And Mike Tempane and I at Teachers College would debate back and forth over a variety of issues. But I've never had a regular teaching position. And I've always wanted to do what I did in junior high school, which was to write. I've been doing that.
Common denominator across all of this.
Yeah, I've been doing that since I was 14.
Say write a book and Diane Ravitch will come.
So I have 60 years behind me of writing.
If you were offered that position again, would you take it?
Which one?
Back in D.C.?
As Assistant Secretary of Education?
Or
you
Secretary
never
of
go
Education?
back. There was a point in my life where I would have liked to do it, but I'm first of all, I'm way too old, and second of all, I don't have any ambition to serve in any public office at this point.
Again.
I mean, I've passed that point.